The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when Penelope Thompson had already decided it would be just another day of invisible existence. But the cream-colored envelope with her name written in careful script made her hands tremble as she stood in the general store where she worked, sorting through mail that was never meant for her. She was 22 years old and had spent the last 7 years in Agua Caliente, Arizona, working for the Hendersons who owned the store, living in a tiny room above the stockroom and watching life happen to other people. The year was 1878, and in all that time, nobody had invited her to a dance, a church social, a Sunday dinner, or anything else that might make her feel like she belonged to the community instead of just existing on its edges. The other young women in town had stopped trying to include her years ago, not out of cruelness exactly, but because Penelope had a way of fading into the background, of being so quiet and unremarkable that people simply forgot she was there. The envelope was addressed to her in handwriting she did not recognize. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she turned it over, finding no return address. Mrs. Henderson was in the back room taking inventory, and the store was empty of customers in the mid-morning heat that made the Arizona desert shimmer like water outside the windows. Penelope's fingers shook as she carefully opened the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words that changed everything. "Miss Thompson," it began, "my name is Quentin Harper. You do not know me, but I have seen you many times when I come to town for supplies. I am a man of few words and fewer social graces, but I am writing to ask if you would do me the honor of accompanying me to the harvest social next Saturday evening. I understand this is forward of me, but I am not a man who knows how to do things the usual way. If you are willing, please leave word with Mr. Henderson and I will call for you at 6 o'clock. If you prefer not to accept, I will understand and will not trouble you again. Respectfully, Quentin Harper." Penelope read the letter 3 times, her mind struggling to comprehend that someone had actually invited her somewhere. She tried to picture Quentin Harper and could not immediately place the name with a face. The Harvest Social was the biggest event of the fall season, and she had spent the last 6 Harvest Socials sitting in her room above the store, listening to the music and laughter drifting from the church hall and telling herself she did not mind being alone. "What is that you are holding, Mrs.?" Henderson's voice made Penelope jump. The older woman had emerged from the stockroom with her ledger tucked under her arm, her sharp eyes taking in the letter and Penelope's flushed face. "It is an invitation," Penelope said quietly, still not quite believing it herself. "Mrs. Henderson moved closer, her expression curious rather than prying. She had always been kind to Penelope in a distant sort of way, providing steady work and a safe place to live, but never quite treating her like family despite 7 years of loyal service. "An invitation to what, dear?" "The Harvest Social. A man named Quentin Harper has asked me to accompany him." Something shifted in Mrs. Henderson's expression, a flicker of surprise followed by what might have been concern. "Quentin Harper, the mountain man who lives up in the Rincon Range." Penelope's heart sank slightly. Is he not respectable?" "Oh, he is respectable enough," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "He comes to town maybe once a month for supplies, always pays his bills in full, never causes any trouble. But he is not exactly a social creature, Penelope. He lives alone up in those mountains, trapping and hunting and doing whatever it is mountain men do. I have never known him to attend a social gathering, let alone invite anyone to one." "Then perhaps he is lonely," Penelope said softly, surprising herself with the words. "Perhaps he knows what it feels like to always be on the outside." Mrs. Henderson's expression gentled. "You are thinking of accepting, then?" "I think I am," Penelope admitted. I have never been invited anywhere special before. This might be my only chance." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you should accept. But Penelope, you should know that Quentin Harper is not like the other men in town. He is rough around the edges, not given to small talk or social niceties. Some folks say he is strange, choosing to live up in those mountains all alone when he could have a normal life down here." "Maybe he does not want a normal life," Penelope said, thinking of all the times she had felt like she did not quite fit into the normal life everyone else seemed to want. "Maybe he wants something different." Mrs. Henderson smiled slightly. "Perhaps you are right. Well, if you are going to accept, we should get word to him, and you will need something proper to wear. That brown dress you always wear will not do for a social." Penelope's cheeks burned. She owned 3 dresses, all of them simple and worn, all of them chosen for practicality rather than beauty. "I do not have anything else." "Then we will find you something," Mrs. Henderson said with sudden decisiveness. "I have been paying you wages all these years, but you never spend a penny on yourself. It is time you had something nice." The next few days passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Mrs. Henderson took her to the dressmaker, a kind woman named Mrs. Sullivan, who had a dress in deep green fabric that had been ordered by a customer who never came to claim it. With a few quick alterations, it fit Penelope perfectly, bringing out the color of her hazel eyes and making her realize for the first time that she might be pretty if anyone bothered to look closely enough. Penelope left word with Mr. Henderson that she accepted the invitation, and the older man promised to relay the message next time Quentin Harper came to town. The days crawled by with agonizing slowness, each one bringing new worries. What if he changed his mind? What if she disappointed him? What if she did not know how to make conversation, and they spent the whole evening in awkward silence? Saturday arrived with clear skies and temperatures that would cool pleasantly once the sun went down. Penelope spent the afternoon getting ready, washing her long chestnut hair and pinning it up the way Mrs. Sullivan had shown her, putting on the green dress and looking at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. 6 o'clock came, and Penelope waited nervously in the store below, her hands clutching a small reticule that Mrs. Henderson had lent her. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson waited with her, both of them seeming almost as nervous as she felt. The minutes ticked by, and with each one, Penelope's heart sank a little further. He had changed his mind. Of course he had. Why would anyone actually want to spend an evening with her? Then, at 7 minutes past 6, the door opened and a man walked in who made Penelope forget how to breathe. Quentin Harper was nothing like the men she saw every day in town. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the doorway. His arms were thick with muscle, visible even through the clean white shirt he wore, and his chest was solid and strong. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, longer than was fashionable but clean and tied back with a leather cord. His face was weathered from years in the sun and wind, with a strong jaw covered in dark stubble and eyes the color of a winter sky. He looked like he could lift a wagon with his bare hands, like he could survive anything the wilderness threw at him, and Penelope felt something flutter in her chest that she had never felt before. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice deep and rough like distant thunder. "I apologize for being late. My horse threw a shoe on the way down the mountain." "That is quite all right," Penelope managed to say, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. His eyes met hers, and she saw something flicker in their depths. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. He was looking at her like she was worth looking at, and it made her feel dizzy. "You look very nice," he said, the words clearly not coming easily to him. I should have brought you flowers or something. I did not think of it." "I do not need flowers," Penelope said, finding her voice a little stronger. "I just need someone to talk to at the social so I do not stand in the corner all night like I usually do." Something like understanding crossed his face. "I do not much like crowds myself. But I thought maybe it would be easier with someone else who understands what it is like to be on the outside." "You understand that every day of my life," he said simply. They walked to the church hall together, Quentin offering his arm in a gesture that seemed both foreign and natural to him. His arm was solid as granite under her hand, and Penelope felt small and protected next to his massive frame. He walked slowly to match her pace, and she noticed how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, like he was always watching for danger even here in the middle of town. The harvest social was already in full swing when they arrived, the hall decorated with autumn leaves and corn stalks, lanterns casting warm light over the crowd of people dancing and talking and laughing. Penelope felt every eye in the room turn toward them as they entered, felt the whispers start immediately. She wanted to shrink back to disappear, but Quentin's presence beside her was steady and solid. "You want to dance?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I do not know how," she admitted. "Nobody ever asked me before." "I do not know how either," he said. "We can figure it out together." He led her onto the floor, and they moved together awkwardly at first, both of them trying to follow the rhythm of the fiddles and guitars. But Quentin was strong and steady, his large hand warm against her waist, and gradually Penelope relaxed into the movement. She noticed that his other hand, holding hers, was calloused and rough from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "Why did you invite me?" she asked as they moved across the floor, the question that had been burning in her mind for days finally finding its way out. He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because I have watched you for months every time I come to town. You are always working in that store, always quiet and polite, and nobody ever seems to really see you. I know what that feels like, and I thought maybe you might want someone to see you for once." Tears pricked at Penelope's eyes. "You see me?" "Every time I look," he said, his winter sky eyes holding hers. "I see a woman who is stronger than she knows, who keeps going even though she is alone, who deserves so much more than being invisible." "I could say the same about you," Penelope said softly. "Why do you live up in the mountains all alone?" His jaw tightened, and she thought he might not answer. But then he said, "Because it is easier than trying to fit into a world that never wanted me. My parents died when I was 15. I had no family, no prospects, nothing but my own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to give up. I went into the mountains because I could make a living there, and because nobody up there cared that I did not have a family name or social position, or any of the things that matter down here." "Those things do not matter to me either," Penelope said. "I am an orphan too. My parents died of fever when I was 15, and I came here to live with my aunt. She died 2 years later, and the Hendersons gave me work and a place to stay, but I have never had a real home since then. I have just been existing, taking up as little space as possible, trying not to be a burden to anyone." Quentin's hand tightened on her waist. "You are not a burden, and you deserve to take up space. You deserve to be wanted." The music ended, and they stood there in the middle of the floor, looking at each other while people swirled around them. Penelope felt like something was shifting inside her, like ice breaking up after a long winter. They spent the rest of the evening talking, finding a quiet corner where they could sit and share stories about their lives. Quentin told her about his cabin in the Rincon Mountains, about the work of trapping and hunting that kept him fed through the long winters, about the solitude that was both peaceful and lonely. Penelope told him about her days in the store, about the books she read late at night in her little room, about the dreams she had let slip away because she never thought anyone would care about them. The social ended too soon, and Quentin walked her back to the store through the cool desert night. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear Arizona sky, and the air smelled of sage and mesquite. When they reached the store, he turned to face her, his expression serious. "Miss Thompson, I need to be honest with you about something. I did not invite you to the social just to give you one nice evening. I invited you because I have been trying to work up the courage for months to ask you something much bigger." Penelope's heart began to race. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, his large hands flexing at his sides like he was preparing for battle. "I am not a man who knows how to court a woman properly. I do not have the time or the patience for months of Sunday visits and supervised conversations. I live up in those mountains, and it is a hard life, but it is a good life. I have a solid cabin, plenty of game, a good water source, and everything a person needs to live comfortably. What I do not have is someone to share it with." He paused, and Penelope waited, barely breathing. "I am asking if you would consider marrying me," he said, the words rushing out like he had to get them all out before he lost his nerve. "Not right away. I know that would be crazy, but soon. I am asking if you would be willing to leave this town, leave the store, and come live with me in the mountains. I am asking if you would share my whole life forever, not just one evening." Penelope stared at him, her mind reeling. "You want to marry me, but you barely know me." "I know enough," he said firmly. "I know you are kind and hardworking. I know you understand loneliness. I know you do not judge me for being different. I know that when I look at you, I see someone I could build a life with, someone who might want the same kind of different life that I want." "This is insane," Penelope whispered, but even as she said it, she felt a wild hope rising in her chest. "People do not get married after one evening together." "Some people do," Quentin said, "especially out here where life is hard and unpredictable. I am not asking you to give me an answer tonight. I am just asking you to think about it, to consider whether maybe you want something more than working in that store for the rest of your life. Whether you want to be seen and wanted and needed every single day instead of being invisible." "Why me?" Penelope asked, her voice shaking. "You could have any woman in town if you wanted." "I do not want any woman in town," he said, his winter sky eyes intense. "I want you. I have wanted you since the first time I saw you 6 months ago, organizing those shelves in the store like each can of beans mattered. I have watched you be patient with difficult customers, watched you work from sunrise to sunset without complaint, watched you exist in this town without anyone really appreciating you. And I thought about how different things could be up in my cabin, where you would not have to be invisible anymore, where you could take up all the space you wanted." Penelope felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I need time to think." "Take all the time you need," Quentin said gently. "I will be back in town in 2 weeks for supplies. You can give me your answer then. If it is no, I will accept it and never trouble you again. But if it is yes—" His voice trailed off, but his eyes said everything his words did not. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and courtly, and then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond the lamplight. Penelope barely slept that night. She lay in her narrow bed above the stockroom, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of the evening. Every word Quentin had spoken, every touch of his hand, every time he had looked at her like she mattered. She thought about his offer, about what it would mean to leave the only life she knew and go into the mountains with a man she had just met. It was crazy. It was reckless. It was everything she had been taught not to do. And yet, what was the alternative? Stay here forever, working in the store, growing old alone, never being anything more than the quiet girl who sorted the mail and swept the floors. Watch other women get married, have children, build lives while she remained forever on the outside looking in. The next morning at breakfast, Mrs. Henderson took one look at Penelope's face and said, "He asked you something big, did he not? How did you know?" "Because Quentin Harper is not the kind of man to do anything halfway," Mrs. Henderson said, sitting down across from Penelope at the small table in the back room. "What did he ask?" Penelope hesitated, then told her everything. About the proposal, about the cabin in the mountains, about the offer to share his whole life. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long time after Penelope finished speaking. Finally, she said, "What does your heart tell you to do?" "My heart tells me to say yes," Penelope admitted. "But my head says it is crazy to marry a man I barely know." "Your heart is wiser than your head in this case," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "Penelope, I have watched you for 7 years, and I have seen you slowly disappear. You work hard, you never complain, but you are not truly living. You are just surviving. Quentin Harper is offering you a chance to actually live. But what if it does not work out? What if I cannot adapt to mountain life? What if he realizes I am not what he thought I was?" "Those are risks," Mrs. Henderson acknowledged. "But what is the risk of staying here? Growing old with regrets about the life you could have had. At least if you go with him, you will know you tried. You will know you took a chance on something real." Penelope spent the next 2 weeks in a state of nervous anticipation. She went about her usual duties at the store, but her mind was always somewhere else, imagining what life might be like in a cabin in the mountains. She had lived her entire life in towns and settlements, always around other people even if they did not pay much attention to her. What would it be like to live in isolation with only one other person for company? The question both terrified and thrilled her. She started paying attention to things she had never noticed before. The women who came into the store with their husbands, the way some couples moved together with an ease born of deep affection, the way others seemed to exist in parallel lives that never quite touched. She listened to the gossip about marriages both happy and miserable, and she realized that there were no guarantees in life. Whether she married Quentin Harper or married some man from town after a proper courtship, there was no way to know if it would work out. But at least with Quentin, she would be taking a chance on someone who had seen her, really seen her, and wanted her anyway. The 2 weeks passed slowly and then all at once. On the 14th day, Penelope woke with a sense of clarity she had never felt before. She knew her answer. She had known it, really, from the moment Quentin had asked the question. She had just needed time to gather the courage to say it out loud. She was helping a customer when the door opened and Quentin walked in, his large frame making the store seem suddenly smaller. Their eyes met across the room, and Penelope saw the question in his gaze, the hope mixed with acceptance of whatever she decided. She finished with the customer, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out change. Then she walked over to where Quentin stood near the door, looking solid and strong and real. "I have an answer for you," she said quietly. "I am listening." "Yes," Penelope said, the single word containing all her hope and fear and determination. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will come to the mountains with you. Yes, I will share your life." Something transformed in Quentin's face, a softness breaking through the rough exterior like sunlight through clouds. "You are sure?" "I am terrified," she admitted, "but I am sure. I have spent 7 years being invisible, and I do not want to spend the rest of my life that way. You see me, Quentin. You look at me like I matter. That is worth taking a risk for." He reached out and took her hand, his rough calluses gentle against her skin. "You do matter. You matter more than you know." They were married 3 days later by the preacher at the small church in town. Mrs. Henderson stood as witness, along with Mr. Henderson, and a few other townspeople who seemed more curious than genuinely happy for them. Penelope wore her green dress and carried a simple bouquet of desert wildflowers that Quentin had picked himself on his ride down from the mountains. The ceremony was brief and practical, the preacher speaking quickly through the traditional words. Quentin's responses were firm and clear, his winter sky eyes never leaving Penelope's face. When it was her turn to speak her vows, she felt her voice shake only slightly before growing stronger. I, Penelope Thompson, take you, Quentin Harper, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin leaned down and kissed her gently, his large hands cupping her face with surprising tenderness. It was Penelope's first kiss, and it felt like a promise. They left Agua Caliente the next morning, all of Penelope's possessions packed into 2 small bags that Quentin secured to his pack horse. Mrs. Henderson had hugged her tightly, pressing a small purse of coins into her hand and making her promise to come visit sometimes. Mr. Henderson had shaken Quentin's hand and told him to take good care of her. Then they were riding out of town, Penelope on a gentle mare that Quentin had bought specifically for her, following her husband into the mountains that would be her new home. The ride took most of the day. They followed a trail that climbed steadily upward, leaving the desert scrub behind and moving into terrain covered with juniper and pine. The air grew cooler and clearer, and Penelope could see for miles across the landscape. Quentin rode ahead, occasionally turning to check on her, his body moving with the horse like they were one creature. They stopped once to rest and water the horses at a stream that tumbled over smooth rocks. Quentin helped Penelope down from her mare, his hand steady at her waist, and she realized with a flutter of nervousness that they were truly alone now. No chaperones, no curious eyes watching them, just the 2 of them in the vast wilderness. How much further? She asked, taking a drink from the canteen he offered. Another 2 hours, he said. The cabin is at the base of a canyon where there is good water and shelter from the worst weather. You will be able to see it soon once we get over this next ridge. They rode on, and as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they crested a ridge and Penelope saw the cabin for the first time. It sat in a small valley surrounded by tall pines, a sturdy structure made of logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Behind it, a mountain rose up dramatically, and in front of it, a clear stream ran through a meadow filled with late-season grass. It is beautiful, Penelope breathed. It is home, Quentin said simply. Our home now. They rode down into the valley as the last light painted everything gold and orange. Quentin helped Penelope dismount in front of the cabin, then led both horses to a small barn he had built to one side. Penelope stood on the porch, looking out at the view, feeling something settle inside her that she had not known was unsettled. When Quentin returned, he carried her bags in one hand like they weighed nothing. Let me show you inside. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping area at one end, a kitchen area with a wood stove at the other, and a sitting area with a fireplace in between. Everything was clean and well maintained, the furniture simple but sturdy, clearly made by hand. A bearskin rug lay in front of the fireplace, and shelves lined the walls holding supplies and a few books. It is not fancy, Quentin said, setting down her bags, but it keeps out the cold and the wind, and it is solid. It is wonderful, Penelope said honestly. I have lived in that tiny room above the store for 7 years. This feels like a palace. He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. I am glad you think so. Are you hungry? I can make us some supper. They worked together to prepare a meal of venison stew and fresh bread that Quentin had somehow managed to bake. As they ate, sitting at the rough wooden table, Penelope felt the strangeness of the situation wash over her. She was married. She was in a cabin in the mountains with a man who had been a stranger just 2 weeks ago. By all rights, she should be terrified. Instead, she felt more at peace than she had in years. After supper, Quentin built up the fire against the cooling mountain air, and they sat together on the bearskin rug, not quite touching but close enough that Penelope could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. "Are you scared?" Quentin asked quietly. Penelope considered the question. "A little," she admitted. "This is all very new, but I am more excited than scared. I feel like my life is finally beginning instead of just continuing." He turned to look at her, the firelight making shadows dance across his strong features. "I will do everything I can to make you happy here. I know I am not easy to live with. I am used to being alone, used to doing things my way. But I want this to work. I want us to build something real together." "I want that too," Penelope said. She reached out and took his hand, marveling at how her fingers disappeared in his much larger grip. "I think we can figure it out together. We are both used to being alone, but maybe that means we will appreciate each other more." Quentin raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I already appreciate you more than you know." That night, they lay together in the bed that took up one corner of the cabin, Quentin holding her carefully like she might break. Penelope rested her head against his solid chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, and thought about how strange it was that she felt safer here in the wilderness with this man she barely knew than she ever had in town surrounded by people. "Quentin," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for seeing me." His arms tightened around her. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for taking a chance on me." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural. Penelope woke each morning to the sound of Quentin moving around the cabin, starting the fire, making coffee. They ate breakfast together as the sun rose over the mountains, turning the sky brilliant shades of orange and pink. Then Quentin would go out to check his trap lines or hunt for game, and Penelope would work on the tasks around the cabin. She learned to cook on the wood stove, adapting recipes she knew to the ingredients available in the mountains. She learned to preserve meat for the winter, to make candles and soap, to churn butter from the milk of the cow Quentin kept in the barn. She learned the rhythms of mountain life, so different from the routine of the store but satisfying in a way she had never experienced. In the evenings, after supper, they would sit together and talk. Quentin was not a naturally talkative man, but with her, he opened up slowly, sharing stories about his life, his thoughts about the world, his dreams for their future. Penelope found herself talking more than she ever had, telling him things she had never told anyone, finding that he listened with his full attention like every word mattered. "I always wanted to learn to read better," he admitted one night. "I can manage well enough, but I never had much schooling. My parents died before I learned more than the basics." "I can teach you," Penelope said immediately. "I read all the time. We can work on it together." So they added reading lessons to their evening routine. Penelope would sit beside Quentin on the bearskin rug, a book open between them, patiently helping him work through passages that challenged him. She loved watching his face when he successfully navigated a difficult sentence, the way his whole expression lit up with accomplishment. "You are a good teacher," he told her one night, his arm around her shoulders as they sat by the fire. "Patient, kind, everything a teacher should be." "You are a good student," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "Determined, willing to try even when it is hard. The physical intimacy between them grew gradually, both of them learning each other's bodies and preferences with a mix of awkwardness and genuine care. Quentin was always gentle despite his size and strength, always making sure Penelope felt safe and wanted. She discovered that she loved the feel of his muscled arms around her, the way he could lift her like she weighed nothing, the contrast between his rough exterior and his tender heart. One morning in early November, about 6 weeks after they had married, Penelope woke feeling dizzy and nauseous. She barely made it outside before she was sick, retching into the bushes beside the cabin while Quentin held her hair back and rubbed her shoulders. "Should I ride to town for the doctor?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "No," Penelope said, wiping her mouth with the handkerchief he offered. "I do not think I need a doctor. I think I might be with child." Quentin went very still. "You think you are pregnant? It would make sense," Penelope said, still feeling shaky. "It has been 6 weeks and I have missed my monthly courses, and this sickness is exactly what Mrs. Henderson told me happens at the beginning." Quentin picked her up without warning, cradling her against his chest like she was something precious and fragile. "We need to get you back to bed. You need to rest." "Quentin, I am fine," Penelope protested, even as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I do not need to spend the next 8 months in bed." But she could see the fear in his winter sky eyes, the worry that went bone deep. "What if something goes wrong? What if you need help and we are too far from town? What if I lose you?" Penelope cupped his rough cheek with her hand, making him look at her. "You are not going to lose me. I am strong, Quentin. Stronger than I look. We will figure this out together, just like we have figured out everything else." He carried her back inside and settled her gently on the bed, then sat beside her, his large hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "I never thought I would have a family," he said quietly. "I never thought anyone would want to build a life with me. And now you are here, and there is a baby coming, and I am terrified of doing something wrong." "We will both do things wrong," Penelope said softly. "That is what life is, making mistakes and learning from them, but we will do them wrong together and we will figure it out." The morning sickness lasted for several weeks, but gradually Penelope's body adjusted. Her stomach began to swell, and she felt the first fluttering movements of the baby inside her. Quentin was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worrying about her doing too much work, insisting on taking over tasks he thought might be too strenuous. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Penelope told him one afternoon when he tried to stop her from carrying water from the stream. "I need to stay active and strong so the birth will go well. I just want to take care of you," he said, looking almost hurt. "You do take care of me," she assured him, setting down the bucket and moving into his arms. "You take wonderful care of me every single day, but you have to let me do things too. I need to feel useful and capable, not like an invalid." He held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "I am sorry. I am just scared. You and this baby are everything to me. If something happened to either of you, I would not survive it." "Nothing is going to happen," Penelope said firmly. "We are going to have this baby, and you are going to be an amazing father, and we are going to keep building this life together." As winter settled over the mountains, covering everything in snow and forcing them to spend most of their time inside the cabin, Penelope felt their bond deepening. They were truly alone now, cut off from the rest of the world by weather and distance, and instead of feeling trapped, Penelope felt free. Here, in this small cabin with this strong, gentle man, she could be completely herself. No need to fade into the background. No need to make herself small and unobtrusive. Quentin wanted her to take up space, wanted to hear her thoughts and opinions, wanted her presence in every moment of every day. They talked about everything during those long winter evenings. About their childhoods, their fears, their hopes for the future. About what kind of parents they wanted to be, what kind of life they wanted to give their children. About the practical matters of expanding the cabin to make room for a growing family. About teaching their children to love and respect the wilderness that would be their home. "You ever regret saying yes?" Quentin asked her one night as they lay in bed with her back against his chest, his large hand spread protectively over her swollen belly. "Never," Penelope said immediately. "Not even for a second. Do you regret asking me?" "Every time I look at you, I thank God I found the courage to write that letter," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have made my life into something I never thought it could be. You have given me a reason to be glad I am alive instead of just surviving." Penelope turned in his arms to face him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "You did the same for me. You saw me when I was invisible. You wanted me when nobody else did. You gave me a life that is real and meaningful instead of just empty days passing by." He kissed her then, deep and slow, and Penelope felt the baby kick between them as if to remind them it was there too, part of this love they were building. As winter gave way to spring, Penelope's belly grew round and full. She moved more slowly now, her body heavy with the child she carried, but she had never felt more alive. Quentin prepared for the birth with the same intensity he brought to everything, reading the medical book he had purchased on his last trip to town, gathering supplies, making sure they had everything they might need. What if the baby comes and something goes wrong? He asked one evening in late April, his face tight with worry. "What if you need help I cannot give?" "Then we will deal with it," Penelope said calmly. "Women have been giving birth for thousands of years, Quentin. Most of the time, everything goes fine, and I trust you completely. If anyone can help me through this, it is you." The baby came on a warm May morning when the mountains were green and the stream was running high with snowmelt. Penelope woke before dawn with pains in her back and belly, and she knew immediately what was happening. She woke Quentin gently, watching his face transform from sleepy confusion to sharp alertness. "It is time," she said simply. The labor lasted through the morning and into the afternoon. Quentin stayed with her the entire time, supporting her when she needed to walk, giving her water when she was thirsty, wiping her face with cool cloths when the pain made her sweat. He was calm and steady, his strength lending her courage when the contractions made her want to scream. "You are doing so well," he told her again and again, his deep voice an anchor in the storm of pain. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known. You can do this." And she did. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Penelope gave one final push, and their son entered the world, screaming his displeasure at the sudden cold and brightness. Quentin caught him with shaking hands, his face transformed by wonder as he stared at the tiny, squirming infant. "It is a boy," he said, his voice breaking. "We have a son, Penelope." They named him Thomas after Quentin's father, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. Quentin held him like he was made of spun glass, his massive hands cradling the tiny body with infinite gentleness. Penelope watched her husband with their son and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it almost hurt. The weeks after Thomas's birth were exhausting but full of joy. The baby needed to eat constantly, and sleep became a distant memory for both of them. But Quentin was an active partner in the work of caring for their son, changing soiled cloths without complaint, walking the floor with the baby when he was fussy, singing to him in his deep, rumbling voice when nothing else would settle him. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Quentin told Penelope one night as they sat together watching Thomas sleep in the cradle he had built. "I thought I understood love when I married you, but this is something different, something even bigger." "It does not replace what we have," Penelope said softly. "It just expands it. We love him together, and that love makes what we have between us stronger." As Thomas grew from an infant to a toddler, Penelope watched her husband transform further. The rough mountain man who had invited her to share his life became a devoted father who got down on the floor to play with his son, who taught him to identify animal tracks in the dirt, who carried him on his shoulders through the forest, pointing out birds and plants. Quentin was patient with Thomas's endless questions, creative in finding ways to entertain him, protective without being smothering. They made occasional trips to Agua Caliente, riding down the mountain so Penelope could visit the Hendersons and show off their growing son. Each time, Penelope was struck by how different her life had become from what it once was. She watched the other women in town, some married, some still single, all of them living out their lives in familiar patterns. She thought about how she might have been one of them if Quentin had not seen her, had not invited her to something special. "You ever miss town life?" Mrs. Henderson asked during one of these visits, watching Penelope and Thomas together. "Not even for a moment," Penelope said honestly. "My life in the mountains is hard sometimes, but it is real. I have a husband who adores me, a son who brings me joy every day, and a home that is truly mine. What more could I want?" Mrs. Henderson smiled. "I am so glad you took that chance, Penelope. You have bloomed into the woman you were always meant to be." When Thomas was 3 years old, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the morning sickness was even worse, and she spent the first few months feeling constantly exhausted. But Quentin was there, taking on more of the work around the cabin, keeping Thomas entertained and out from underfoot, making sure Penelope rested as much as possible. "You are going to wear yourself out," Penelope told him one evening when she caught him mending clothes by lamplight after Thomas had gone to bed, a chore she usually handled. "I am fine," he said, setting aside the sewing to pull her into his arms. "You are growing our second child. That is work enough for anyone. Let me take care of the other things." Their daughter was born in the winter, during a snowstorm that made the cabin feel like the only warm place in the universe. She came quickly, her birth easier than Thomas's had been, and she emerged into the world with a head full of dark curls and lungs that could shatter glass. "She has your determination," Quentin said with a laugh as the baby screamed her displeasure. "Listen to her. She is fierce." They named her Margaret, after Penelope's mother, and she was indeed fierce. Where Thomas had been an easy baby, content to watch the world with serious eyes, Margaret demanded attention constantly. She wanted to be held, wanted to nurse, wanted to be entertained every waking moment. But she also brought a different kind of joy, her smiles like sunshine breaking through clouds, her laughter infectious. The years passed in a blur of activity and love. Thomas grew into a thoughtful boy who loved helping his father with the traps and learning about the wilderness. Margaret grew into a wild, fearless girl who climbed trees and caught frogs and followed her brother everywhere. Penelope watched her children grow and felt grateful every single day for the life she had built. When Thomas was 7 and Margaret was 4, Quentin expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms so the children could each have their own space. He worked on it through the summer, his muscled body glistening with sweat as he lifted logs and hammered joints. And Penelope watched him with the same flutter in her chest she had felt that first night at the harvest social. "You are staring," he said one afternoon, catching her watching him from the porch where she was shelling peas. "I like looking at you," she said without embarrassment. "You are nice to look at." He grinned and came over to kiss her, tasting of sawdust and salt. You are not so bad yourself." That night, after the children were asleep, they made love with the familiar passion that had never faded between them. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Quentin traced patterns on Penelope's bare shoulder. "You remember that first social?" he asked quietly. "When I was so nervous I could barely speak." "You hit it well," Penelope said, smiling at the memory. "You seemed so confident and sure of yourself." "I was terrified," he admitted. "I thought you would laugh at me or refuse to dance with me. I thought you would see right through me and realize I had no business trying to court someone as special as you." Penelope propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "I thought the same thing. I thought you would realize I was just the invisible girl from the store and regret inviting me." "I have never regretted it," Quentin said seriously, his winter sky eyes holding hers. "Not for one single second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope. You and our children. You gave me a family when I never thought I would have one. You gave me a reason to be more than just a man surviving alone in the mountains." "You gave me the same thing," Penelope whispered. "You saw me when I was invisible. You invited me to share your whole life forever. You made me feel like I mattered." "You do matter," he said fiercely. "You matter more than anything in this world." When Thomas was 10 and Margaret was 7, Penelope found herself pregnant again. This pregnancy was unexpected, and at first she worried that she might be too old for another child. She was 32 now, and the mountain life, while fulfilling, was physically demanding, but Quentin was thrilled. "Another child," he said, his hand on her still flat belly. "Another person to love. How can that be anything but wonderful?" This pregnancy was different from the others. Penelope felt more tired, the baby seemed bigger, and everything took more effort. But she had learned over the years how to balance the work of maintaining a mountain household with the needs of her body, and she moved through the months with the confidence of experience. Their second son was born on a crisp autumn morning when the aspen trees were golden and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. He was bigger than Thomas had been, with a shock of dark hair and his father's strong features already visible even in his infant face. "He is going to be big like his father," Penelope said, cradling the baby against her chest. "Poor boy," Quentin joked. "Being big is not always easy. People expect you to be strong all the time, to never need help or comfort." "He will have us to teach him that it is all right to need people," Penelope said. "That being strong does not mean being alone." They named him James, and he was indeed a big baby who grew into a big child. Thomas took his role as older brother seriously, helping care for James and teaching him things as he grew. Margaret was less interested in babies, preferring to spend her time outdoors exploring and climbing, but even she softened when James smiled at her. The family settled into new rhythms. Thomas began to accompany his father on longer trips, learning the skills he would need to survive in the mountains. Margaret helped her mother with the garden and the animals, though she did so with less enthusiasm than Thomas showed for his father's work. James was the baby, toddling around the cabin and bringing chaos and laughter wherever he went. Penelope watched her family grow and change, and felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. She thought sometimes about the girl she had been, working in that store in Agua Caliente, invisible and alone, and she could barely recognize herself in that memory. She had grown into a strong, capable woman who could birth babies, preserve food for winter, handle a rifle when necessary, and manage a household in the middle of the wilderness. She had become someone who mattered, someone who was seen and valued every single day. When James was 5 years old, Quentin took Penelope on a trip, just the two of them, leaving the children with a trusted family who lived a few miles away. They rode up into the high country, to a meadow filled with wildflowers where they could see for miles in every direction. "Why did you bring me here?" Penelope asked as they sat together on a blanket, the horses grazing nearby. "Because I wanted to remind you that you are still you," Quentin said. "Not just a mother, not just my wife, but Penelope, the woman I fell in love with. Sometimes I worry that you get lost in taking care of all of us, that you forget to take care of yourself." Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes. "I do not feel lost. I feel found. Everything I do for you and the children, I do because I want to, because it brings me joy." "I know," he said, pulling her close. "But I also want you to know that I see you, not just as the mother of my children or the person who keeps our home running, but as Penelope. The woman who took a chance on a rough mountain man because she wanted something more than being invisible. The woman who has the courage to live a hard life because she knows it is a real life." They made love there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and mountain air, reconnecting as man and woman rather than just parents. Afterward, they lay together watching clouds drift across the sky, and Penelope felt a profound sense of peace. "I love our life," she said quietly. "I love you, and I love our children, and I love this place. I would not change anything." "Even the hard parts?" Quentin asked. "The isolation, the difficulty, the constant work. Even the hard parts," Penelope confirmed. "Because the hard parts make the good parts better. Because I would rather have a difficult life that is real and meaningful than an easy life that is empty." They rode back to collect their children the next day, and life continued its busy rhythm. The years passed with the turning of seasons. Thomas grew into a young man who looked more like his father every day, tall and broad-shouldered with steady hands and a quiet confidence. Margaret grew into a spirited girl who could outride most boys and had no interest in traditional feminine pursuits. James grew into a sturdy child who had his father's size and his mother's gentle heart. Penelope and Quentin grew older together, their bodies bearing the marks of hard work and mountain living. Quentin's hair began to show threads of gray, and lines deepened around his eyes. Penelope's hands grew rougher from work, and her body bore the changes of bearing 3 children. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been that night at the harvest social, young and nervous, and hoping for something more. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to find his own piece of land in the mountains, to build his own cabin and start his own life. Penelope felt her heart squeeze at the thought of him leaving, but she also felt proud. They had raised him to be independent and capable, to know what he wanted and have the courage to pursue it. "You will always have a home here," Quentin told his son as they worked together to build the cabin that would be Thomas's first home. "No matter where you go or what you do, you can always come back." "I know, Pa," Thomas said, his voice steady. "You and Ma taught me that. You taught me what it means to have a real home and a real family." Margaret showed no interest in leaving when she reached 18. She declared that she had no intention of getting married and was perfectly happy living in the mountains and helping her parents. Penelope sometimes worried that Margaret was limiting herself, but Quentin told her to let their daughter find her own path. "She knows what she wants," he said. "That is more than most people can say at her age. If she changes her mind later, that is fine. If she does not, that is fine too." James was still young, more interested in the animals around the cabin than in thoughts of the future. He had a way with creatures, managing to befriend even the wildest of them, and Penelope thought he might someday be a rancher or a veterinarian if he chose to leave the mountains. One evening, when Thomas was settled in his own cabin, Margaret was 19 and helping her father with a difficult trapping season, and James was 13 and growing like a weed. Penelope and Quentin sat together on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. They were both in their 40s now, no longer young but not yet old, and the life they had built together was solid and real. "You remember what you asked me in your letter," Penelope said quietly. "You asked if I would share your whole life forever." "I remember," Quentin said, taking her hand. "Every word of that letter is burned into my memory. I was so scared you would say no." "I have been thinking about that phrase," Penelope continued. "Share your whole life forever. Not just part of your life, not just for a while, but your whole life forever. That is what we have done, is it not? We have shared everything. The hard times and the good times, the fear and the joy, the work and the rest. We have built this whole life together, and we will keep building it until one of us is gone. And even then, we will have had this," Quentin said, his voice rough with emotion. "Even when we are old and gray, even when one of us goes first and leaves the other behind, we will have had this whole life together. We will have had something real and true and worth every bit of effort it took to build it." Penelope leaned against his solid shoulder, feeling his arm come around her, and thought about how far they had come from that nervous first meeting. She thought about the girl she had been, invisible and alone, working in a store and dreaming of something more. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and capable and loved beyond measure. "I have never regretted saying yes," she whispered. "Not for one single moment." "And I have never regretted asking," Quentin replied. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope Harper. You always will be." They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, lighting up the vast mountain sky. Inside the cabin, they could hear Margaret humming to herself as she prepared supper, and James's laughter as he played with the dog Quentin had given him for his last birthday. Thomas would be sitting on his own porch now, looking at the same stars, living his own life but still part of the family they had built. Penelope thought about all the years behind them and all the years still to come. There would be more grandchildren someday, when Thomas found someone to share his life with. There would be the joy of watching James grow into the man he was meant to be, of seeing Margaret find her own path, whatever that might be. There would be quiet evenings like this one, sitting together and sharing the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other completely. As the years continued to unfold, the family in the mountains remained close-knit, despite the changes that time inevitably brought. Thomas did eventually marry a woman named Sarah who he met during a trip to a neighboring town. She was a quiet, capable woman who loved the mountains as much as he did, and together they built a life not far from Quentin and Penelope's cabin. When their first child was born, a daughter they named Lily, Penelope held her granddaughter and felt the circle of life complete itself in a way that took her breath away. Margaret surprised everyone when she was 23 by announcing that she had met someone. He was a surveyor who had come through the mountains mapping territory for the government. A man named Daniel, who was fascinated by Margaret's knowledge of the wilderness and her fearless nature. They married in the meadow where Quentin had once taken Penelope for that special trip, and Margaret continued to live her life on her own terms, splitting time between the mountains and the towns where Daniel's work took them. James grew into a gentle giant of a man, even bigger than his father, with a way with animals that bordered on magical. He chose to stay close to home, building his own cabin on the far side of the valley and establishing a small ranch where he raised horses and cattle. He never married, seeming content with his animals and his solitude, but he was a devoted uncle to Thomas's growing family and a constant presence in his parents' lives. Quentin and Penelope grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with all their children and grandchildren gathered around them, a noisy, joyful celebration that lasted long into the night. Quentin stood and raised his glass, his voice still strong despite the gray that now dominated his hair. 20 years ago, I wrote a letter to a woman I barely knew, he said, looking at Penelope with eyes that still held all the love of that first evening. I asked her if she would share my whole life forever, and she was brave enough to say yes. Everything good in my life comes from that decision. My children, my grandchildren, every moment of happiness I have known. Penelope, you have given me more than I ever dreamed possible. Here is to 20 more years and 20 after that, and as many as we can get. To Ma and Pa, Thomas said, raising his own glass. For showing us what real love looks like. Everyone drank, and Penelope felt tears slide down her cheeks. These were her people, her family, built from nothing but hope and courage and a willingness to take a chance on something that seemed impossible. When Penelope was 48 and Quentin was 49, he had an accident while checking his trap lines. A bear, angry and territorial, attacked him before he could reach his rifle. He managed to kill the animal, but not before it had badly mauled his left leg and shoulder. James found him hours later and got him home, where Penelope worked frantically to clean and bind his wounds. "You are not allowed to die," she told him fiercely as she worked, her hands steady despite her fear. "We have too much life left to live together. You are not allowed to leave me." "I do not plan to," Quentin gritted out through the pain. "We made a deal, remember? Forever." He survived, though the injuries left him with a permanent limp and less strength in his left shoulder. For a few weeks, Penelope feared he would fall into despair, unable to do the work that had defined his life for so long. But Quentin adapted, finding new ways to do things, accepting help from his sons when he needed it, and gradually building his strength back up. "I am not the man I used to be," he said one evening, frustration evident in his voice. "You are exactly the man you have always been," Penelope said firmly. "Strong, determined, and too stubborn to let anything keep you down for long. Your body has changed, but your heart has not. That is what matters." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "How did I get so lucky to find you? You were brave enough to write that letter," she reminded him, "and I was brave enough to answer it. We made our own luck." As they moved into their 50s, Quentin and Penelope began to slow down in ways that were both frustrating and natural. They could no longer work from dawn to dusk without rest. They needed more time to recover from physical exertion. Their bodies ached in new and interesting ways, especially when the weather changed. But they also found new rhythms, new ways to spend their time that did not require the same physical demands. Penelope began teaching reading and writing to the grandchildren who were old enough, holding lessons in the cabin during the winter months. Quentin worked with James to expand the ranch, contributing his knowledge and experience even if he could no longer do all the physical labor. They took more time to simply sit together, watching the seasons change, talking about everything and nothing, existing in the comfortable silence of two people who had shared a whole life together. When they celebrated their 30th anniversary, the celebration was quieter than the 20th had been, but no less meaningful. Thomas and Sarah brought their 4 children, the youngest just a baby. Margaret and Daniel came from wherever Daniel's latest survey work had taken them, Margaret still as fierce and independent as ever. James came from his ranch across the valley, bringing fresh beef for the celebration feast. 30 years, Penelope marveled as she and Quentin stood together on their porch after everyone had gone to bed, the cabin full of sleeping grandchildren. "It seems like both forever and no time at all." "It has been the best 30 years of my life," Quentin said, his arm around her waist. "Every day with you has been a gift, even the hard days, especially the hard days," he said, "because we got through them together. That is what matters, Not that life was always easy, but that we faced it together. They stood watching the stars, just as they had done countless times before, and Penelope felt a deep sense of contentment. She thought about the girl she had been, so long ago, invisible and alone in that store in Agua Caliente. She thought about how one letter, one invitation, one moment of courage had changed everything. She thought about all the years of love and work and family that had followed, all the moments both ordinary and extraordinary that had built the life they shared. "I would do it all again," she said quietly. "Every single bit of it. I would say yes again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Quentin said, kissing the top of her head. "1,000 times over I would ask you again." As they moved into their 60s, the mountain life became harder to manage. Quentin's injuries from the bear attack bothered him more in cold weather, and Penelope developed arthritis in her hands that made detailed work painful. They began to talk seriously about what the future might hold, whether they should consider moving closer to town where life might be easier. But in the end, they decided to stay. The mountains were their home, and neither of them could imagine living anywhere else. Thomas and James helped them more with the heavy work, and Margaret came to visit more often, bringing supplies and help when needed. They adapted their lives to their changing bodies, finding new ways to do old tasks, accepting that some things were no longer possible but focusing on what still was. Penelope was 63, and Quentin was 64 when he had a heart attack. It happened suddenly, while he was chopping wood outside the cabin. One moment he was working, the next he was on the ground, gasping for breath and clutching his chest. Penelope ran to him, screaming for James, who was working nearby. Together they got Quentin inside and into bed, and Penelope held his hand while James rode hard for the doctor in town. "You are not leaving me," Penelope said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "We have more time left, Quentin Harper. We are not done yet." "I am not going anywhere," he whispered, his face gray with pain. "Forever, remember? That was the deal." The doctor came and gave Quentin medicine to help his heart, but he was honest about the prognosis. Quentin's heart was weak, and another attack could come at any time. He needed to rest, to avoid stress and strenuous activity, to take better care of himself. For a few weeks, Penelope feared she would lose him. But gradually, Quentin's color returned and his strength improved. He could not do the work he once had, but he could sit on the porch and watch the mountains, could hold his grandchildren and tell them stories, could spend quiet evenings with Penelope by the fire. "I am sorry," he told her one night as they lay in bed, his voice heavy with regret. "I am sorry I cannot do more. I am sorry you have to take care of me instead of the other way around." "We take care of each other," Penelope said firmly. "That is what we have always done. You took care of me through 3 pregnancies and more illnesses than I can count. You have carried me through every hard moment of our life together. Now it is my turn to carry you for a while. That is what forever means." He pulled her close, careful of his weakened body, and held her as tightly as he could. "I love you, Penelope Harper. I have loved you since the moment I saw you in that store, and I will love you until I take my last breath." "And I love you," she whispered back. "Always and forever, just like we promised." Quentin lived for 3 more years after the heart attack. 3 years of gradually diminishing strength, but no diminishing of love. He spent his days watching the mountains change with the seasons, playing with his ever-growing number of grandchildren, and sitting with Penelope talking about the life they had built together. He held on to see Thomas's youngest daughter graduate from the small school that had been established in the nearest town. He held on to dance with Margaret at a celebration of her 10th wedding anniversary. He held on to see James finally find a woman he wanted to marry, a widow from town who loved animals as much as he did. He died on a cool October morning, with Penelope holding his hand and all their children gathered around his bed. His last words were to her, whispered so quietly that only she could hear them. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for asking," she whispered back, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for inviting me to share your whole life forever." He smiled, that same smile that had transformed his face all those years ago at the harvest social. And then he was gone. Penelope mourned deeply, but she did not fall apart. She had spent 37 years building a life with Quentin, raising children, creating a family, and that work continued even after he was gone. She stayed in the cabin in the mountains, refusing all offers from her children to move in with them. This was her home, the place where she had been seen and loved and valued. She would not leave it. The years after Quentin's death were both lonely and full. Lonely because she missed him every single day, missed his presence beside her, missed his voice and his touch and his steady strength. But full because the life they had built together continued. Her children visited often, bringing grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The cabin was rarely empty for long. Penelope lived to be 74 years old, spending her final years surrounded by the family that had grown from one brave letter and one courageous yes. She taught her great-grandchildren to read, told them stories about their grandfather and the life they had built in the mountains, and made sure they understood that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any hardship. She died peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning when the mountains were green and the wildflowers were blooming. Her children found her in the bed she had shared with Quentin for so many years, a peaceful expression on her face and a letter clutched in her hand. It was the letter Quentin had written to her all those decades ago, inviting her to the harvest social, asking her to share his whole life forever. She had kept it all these years, and it had been her most precious possession. They buried her next to Quentin in the meadow, where he had once brought her to remind her that she was still herself, not just a mother and a wife, but Penelope. The whole family gathered for the funeral, 3 generations of people who existed because 2 lonely souls had been brave enough to take a chance on each other. Thomas stood at the graveside and spoke about his parents, his voice steady despite his grief. "My father was a mountain man, strong and capable and tough. My mother was a store clerk, quiet and invisible to most people. They should never have found each other. They should never have built the life they did. But they were brave enough to try, and because of that bravery, all of us are here. They showed us what real love looks like. Not the easy kind that happens when everything is perfect, but the hard kind that grows stronger with every challenge faced together. They showed us that being seen and valued is worth any risk. They showed us that family is worth building, worth fighting for, worth everything." Margaret stood beside her brother, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Ma used to tell me that she had never been invited anywhere special before Pa asked her to that social. She said she spent years being invisible, being overlooked, being forgotten. But Pa saw her. He saw her worth when nobody else did, and she was brave enough to say yes to him, to say yes to a life that was hard and isolated and full of challenges. Because she knew that a hard life that was real was better than an easy life that was empty." James, the youngest, spoke last. His voice was thick with emotion. "They taught us to be brave, to take chances, to build something that matters. I look around at all of us here, at this family that started with one letter and one yes, and I see their legacy. We are their legacy. Every one of us exists because they loved each other enough to build a life together against all odds." As the family dispersed after the funeral, returning to their own lives in town and on ranches and in the mountains, The cabin where Penelope and Quentin had built their life together stood empty for the first time in nearly 4 decades. But it would not stay empty for long. Thomas's oldest son, following in his grandfather's footsteps, had already announced his intention to restore the cabin and live there with his own young family. The legacy would continue, the life built in those mountains would go on, and the story of the mountain man who invited an invisible girl to share his whole life forever would be told and retold to each new generation, because that story mattered. It mattered that Quentin had been brave enough to see what others missed. It mattered that Penelope had been brave enough to say yes to the unknown. It mattered that they had built something real and lasting together, something that went beyond just the two of them and created ripples that would continue long after they were gone. In the end, that was what forever meant. Not just a lifetime together, though they had that, but a love that continued beyond death, living on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. A love that proved that being brave enough to invite someone to share your life, and being brave enough to accept that invitation, could change everything not just for two people, but for generations to come. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the whole story from beginning to end. The cabin remained, solid and strong, a testament to what could be built with two determined hearts and willing hands. And somewhere in the meadow where wildflowers bloomed every spring, where two gravestones stood side by side bearing the names Quentin Harper and Penelope Harper, their story continued to whisper its truth to anyone willing to listen. She had never been invited anywhere special before that letter arrived. He had never thought anyone would want to share his rough mountain life. But together, they had built something more special than either of them could have imagined. They had built a whole life, lived it fully, and left behind a legacy of love and courage that would endure as long as the mountains themselves. And that was their happily ever after, complete and perfect and exactly what they had always needed. Two lonely souls who found each other against all odds, who were brave enough to build something real together, who proved that love was always worth the risk. Their story began with an invitation to share a life forever, and it ended exactly as it should have, with that promise fulfilled completely. The end had come for both of them, but the life they built together lived on, as permanent and solid as the mountains that had been their home, as enduring as the love that had sustained them through 37 years of marriage and everything those years had brought. They had shared a whole life forever, exactly as promised, and in doing so had created something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. That was the greatest gift they could have given, not just to each other, but to all the generations that would follow in their footsteps.